Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hi, and welcome to Then and Now. My name is Caroline Luce, and I'm a researcher and lecturer at the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment and the Communications Chair for UCAFT, the union that represents lecturers and librarians across the UC. I will be your host for today of this special episode of Then and Now, featuring two Luskin Center for History and Policy student research fellows. Sammy Feldblum and John Schmidt are both graduate students in the UCLA Geography Department, and along with Fariha Khan, are authors of a new research report, Crisis and the Transformation of Academic Labor, A View from the University of California. You can find a link to the report in the details of this podcast episode and at www.luskinCenter.history.ucla.edu. Sammy, John, thank you so much for joining me today. I wanted to start with you. Tell us a little bit about your paths to this project, the major research questions you wanted to explore, or the popular assumptions that you wanted to challenge.
Yeah, thanks so much, Caroline. It's great being on here with you. Thanks for having us on. We came to this project organically, more or less. Our first year on campus, we started in the geography program together. And there was a sort of fiery moment of labor organizing that happened across the UC with grad students working toward a COLA. So Wildcat strike started on UC Santa Cruz's campus, and then graders who were withholding grades were fired en masse, and so it spread across the whole UC system. And the two of us got involved in that process, and I think it offered something of, it sort of elucidated to some degree some of the it really focused a light on kind of the working conditions of us as graduate students. And then also at some of these rallies that we were attending and we were taking part in, there were people coming from the UCAFT, the union representing the lecturers who were speaking. There were undergrads who were speaking and thinking a bit about conditions for undergrad student workers. And so it really sort of helped to turn a lens, I think, to working conditions for different groups of workers across campus. And then as in sort of the midst of that, as things really felt like they were heating up, COVID hit. And I don't know if you've heard about that. And everything sort of came to a crashing halt. University life went online. And even though people were still trying to continue organizing, it really put the kibosh on that effort, I think. So John and I then wrote a retrospective sort of taking stock of what had happened with the COLA movement for the Brooklyn Rail. And that was the first thing that we wrote together about labor at the UC. And as we were writing that, you all with the UCAFT were bargaining with the school. And so we began to kind of look at other, look at other classes of laborers at the UC and to think a little bit about that. But also, part of what we drew from was a really great term paper that John had written on the COLA movement. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, John?
Yeah, so COLA here refers to the idea of a cost of living adjustment for graduate student workers at the university, which was something that there was a lot of momentum towards leading up to COVID in early 2020. And it was something, as Sammy suggests, that we were both really active in and involved in. And I was reflecting on it in a class, actually, for a final term paper, thinking sort of about it in terms of the broader picture of higher education as a public good, and what it means for the kind of work that gets done at universities when public higher education is no longer really thought of as a public good. So what consequences does that have for labor conditions generally? And what does it mean for graduate student employees of the university and lecturers at the university, people who don't have tenure. And that led so sort of naturally, I think, into this question about so-called contingent faculty at the University of California, especially given the contract bargaining session that you all were gearing up for at that time. So I think what's important is sort of recognizing that the university is not just a place where a new generation of people is being educated for jobs in the future, but it's also a site where a lot of people are employed in the present, right? So it's a site of jobs for a whole lot of people. The UC is one of the largest employers in California. So taking a really sort of close look at those labor conditions, I think, was the motivation for the project originally.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, one of the things we talk a lot about in UCAFT is how many of us are actually grad student alumni of the university where we teach. So it seems to make organic sense that if you're exploring the problem of what's happening to graduate students, that you would carry that forward into what's happening with lecturers and adjuncts, because as your report makes so clear, we are in a moment where 43% of the national professorate is part-time and contingent. An additional 20% of the national professorate is full-time contingent. And those folks who are on the tenure track, or at least ladder ranked faculty, are now a minority. There's only about 37% as you lay out. So, some of those statistics are not new to me as someone who's been involved in contingent faculty organizing, but the report does just a beautiful job of really making plain the reality of our moment. You also, and I say this as a historian, do a great job of sort of explaining how we got here. So I thought we'd start by kind of talking about how we arrived at this moment where contingent faculty vastly outnumber those who have the protections of tenure. You do draw on a lot of other people's literature and you synthesize it in really, really elegant ways. And you do so by kind of starting with two sort of framing concepts that you draw on that I was hoping you might, for the readers here who may be less familiar with this literature, explain a little bit and unpack for us. So you have these two. I don't know if each one of you wants to take one, but we have the gig university and what you call the devolutionary cycle. I would love to hear more about those and, how those frame the history of the UC over the past 70 years.
Yeah, well, so the gig university or the gig academy is a concept that's sort of been elaborated recently by Adriana Kazar and her colleagues over at USC. And really, it's a metaphor or an analogy where they're sort of looking at the labor conditions that exist, not just for teaching faculty and researchers at universities, but almost everyone who's working at universities, and observing that the labor conditions for those university employees are very similar in a lot of ways to the kind of labor conditions that you see in what is popularly thought of as the gig economy, right? The Lyfts and the Ubers of the world, which is really in both instances, you have a kind of widespread deprofessionalization, outsourcing, and growing use of contingent labor contracts, right? So there's a way in which all of these labor practices that are really intensively part of the gig economy are also cropping up in all sorts of ways for teachers at universities and for other staff members of universities. And so I think it's a really provocative analogy because it refers to something that a lot of people are familiar with and links it to what's commonly thought of as this kind of sort of rarefied world of university teaching. But what's important to recognize is that the process actually began much earlier at universities, and it's something that began before these platform firms even existed, right? And it goes all the way back to the 1970s, which is sort of an era of epochal shift in the American economy and the birth of what many scholars call neoliberalism. And that is the sort of moment when you have the beginning of the erosion of this sort of tenure model of academic employment at universities. And so, as you mentioned, the tenure share of the teachers in this country has sort of stayed stagnant since 1969, with the result that it's now a minority of all of the teaching positions in American universities. About 37% of the total number of teachers are tenured, and a much greater share of that teaching responsibility is instead shoved off onto people who often have annual or less than annual contracts, really short lead time for employment offers, and little or no job security. And this is the contingent academic labor force that we talk about.
Yeah, we certainly talk in my classes about how misclassification is not innovation, right? It's exploitation. There's nothing innovative about labor exploitation. So you guys elegantly sort of link this gigification process, right? This transformation of tenured, stable, protected academic jobs and the rise of these short-term part-time gigs to this grander process of kind of financialization, or as you call it, de-evolutionary cycle. So Sammy, maybe you could explain to us kind of how that de-evolutionary cycle tracks alongside this gigification process.
Yeah, exactly. So the devolutionary cycle is an idea from Chris Newfield, who's a long time now left UC Santa Barbara, but was a long time professor there. And it's a description of sort of how privatization happens over time to public university systems. And so kind of the common story, I think, or the common understanding is that the sort of budgetary constraints, and then, particularly kind of big moments of budgetary constraint, like the financial crisis in 2008 or something, mean that states are less able to fund public education systems and are therefore then forced to cut funding and rely increasingly on tuition to make up those shortfalls. But for Newfield, that's kind of half of the picture. And in fact, both of those, both state funding cuts and then increasing reliance on tuition are sort of two moments in an ongoing cycle. So then it's also the case that increasing reliance on private funding streams, so both tuition from students and then also partnerships with private industry, then make it so that policymakers or legislators or budget makers feel able to reduce state fundings. And each of those things then contributes to the other over time. And that then kind of changes, to go back a little bit to what John was saying earlier, that sort of changes the goals and outcomes of what a university system is then meant to do. So where a robustly funded public system is kind of aimed, at least ideally and at its best, toward the cultivation of the public good, and that's something we can talk about a little more. But a more privatized system, then the sort of benefits are recouped by those by those who are providing the funding for it, right? So on the one hand, that means kind of capture of value that's produced in universities by these private industrial partners. And then on the other hand, there's kind of an accentuation of the idea that what a university is sort of fundamentally about is an earnings benefit for university graduates over their lifetime, over their career. And certainly that's a good thing, happy to have people make more money after they go to university, but it's sort of an emphasis of that side of university education and then a de-emphasis of the more public mission of the university that this devolutionary cycle produces. And so for us, the devolutionary cycle is kind of it's the larger context for the labor changes that we're describing in the university. It's sort of part and parcel of the transition to a more neoliberal model of the university. And as universities look more like private industry with private funding sources, then that also restructures labor on campuses.
Totally. Yeah, I think you call it a knowledge production regime, right? That it's not just a sort of shift in funding models, but it's an entirely new way of thinking about what knowledge production is for, what it does for society, how we fund it, right? And what motives are driving it. I was so struck, however, in reading your section on Clark Kerr. Clark Kerr is often held up as this, champion of public education, in the mode of Noah Webster and education advocates from the early 20th century. And while I haven't personally read Kerr's pamphlet that you refer to, or I guess it might be a book, The Uses of the University, I was struck by how even he is kind of deploying similar tropes about industry, public-private partnership. I was surprised that I didn't see as big a gap, I will say, between his vision of the university as a public good and what you guys are describing as academic capitalism. I think he even had a phrase where he calls professors as entrepreneurs of knowledge production, which is, of course, that's the Uber, right? Be your own boss. You're an entrepreneur. Hustle culture that surrounds contingent labor. So I just would love to hear a little bit more about the contrast you're trying to build. Tell us more about Clark Kerr's vision, and where you see that vision sort of eroding in successive administration.
I think it's a really good point, the point that you're making. And in fact, Kerr and the Uses of the University is also identifying sort of emergent hierarchies between teaching faculty and research faculty. And that's something that we talk a lot about as a problem of the present. So it's not like we're dealing with sudden sort of breaks here. There's sort of, hints of what's to come later already in Kerr's time, already sort of at the height of the master plan for higher education in California. But I do think the sort of national political economic context for Clark Kerr is different than what comes afterward. And so Clark Kerr was, first chancellor at Berkeley, then president of the whole UC system from the late 1950s through to the 1960s before he was fired by Ronald Reagan, essentially. And he's really writing about administering a sort of complex institution in this era of sort of massive federal inflows of research money into universities nationwide. And in California, that specifically is about defense spending.
Yeah, I was just going to say the UCLA School of Engineering, established right in the middle of World War II as a mechanism of war production to feed engineers into war production facilities throughout the Southern California region.
Exactly. Yeah. And so he's talking about this kind of entrepreneurial mindset that's emerging among faculty who are primarily getting federal research funding, and that's connected to defense in California, and that kind of shifts as the sort of like neoliberal turn happens, and it becomes a less of a sort of like Keynesian kind of economic basis for university funding coming from the state, basically, and that transitions into something that some scholars have called academic capitalism, which maybe Sammy could explain a little bit more. But there's a bigger political economic shift that's happening here.
Exactly. So the transition, Carolyn, you're exactly right to note that already. Kind of the seeds of the seeds of what Sheila Slaughter and Gary Rhodes would later call academic capitalism were already sort of present in Clark Kerr. But then, yeah, as John said, very different political economic context. So despite the fact that in both cases, in both eras, universities are enmeshed into these wider knowledge production regimes, the shape of the regimes is somewhat different. So then amid kind of as part of the neoliberal turn in the 80s, 90s, since then, the beneficiaries again of knowledge production change from the Cold War Keynesian state to Slaughter and Rhodes write that under academic capitalism, the regime values knowledge privatization and profit taking in which institutions, inventor faculty, and corporations have claims that come before those of the public. So it's kind of a privatization then of the benefits of the knowledge production and research being done at universities. And part of that then is a result of change of federal policy making. So they really identify in 1980 the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act that grants universities patent rights to knowledge produced.
That was what I had no idea. That was so interesting to me.
Totally. And then the other thing that they identify and other folks that we were reading also kind of identified as sort of a sea change is in 1972, Congress amending the 1965 Higher Education Act to change how federal funds are distributed to universities and sort of route those federal funds through what later become known as Pell Grants, which kind of recasts universities as competitors for these student dollars. And so, for them, then those are kind of two important modes of, again, this sort of privatization of universities that we see that really help to produce this neoliberal turn.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent, what both of you are also pointing to is the model of kind of social mobility and class structure that Kerr is prefiguring in his vision is one wherein, the student of a factory worker gets to go to college and he becomes an engineer or the manager of the factory rather than the line worker. And so running alongside all of this is just the deindustrialization that comes from globalization. I mean, 1976 through 1982, 75% of industrial employment in Los Angeles sort of evaporates overnight as plants close. And so the entire kind of model of social mobility that the California Master Plan is built on is also eroding under this vision that college was a path to improved incomes, job stability, and middle class living, right? So, I think the profit schema that you're talking about, there's a kind of, analog, invert, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, a complementary function happening vis-a-vis students and their sense of alienation from the promise of higher ed broadly, and then the incentive structures that we create to entice them to come to college, which, as you say, prefigure these inventor professors, right? And this opportunity to be part of cutting edge, groundbreaking research. It's just so fascinating to me how those components kind of work together. So let's talk about that for a second, because, there's evaporation of this vision. I think many of us will be familiar with Ronald Reagan's role in not just ousting Clark Kerr, but in introducing tuition and fees. We, of course, all Californians should, if they're not already familiar with the taxpayer revolts in Proposition 13 and its insidious effects. Something that was very new to me here was what Arnold Schwarzenegger did during his time in office. So maybe we could sort of pick up the timeline there and tell us about some of these more recent decisions that have been made, as you say, in moments of crisis, but continue to have kind of effect. Tell us about Arnold. We need to spend some time with him.
Yeah, well, I maybe just to back up a little bit about sort of the road to the higher education compact and Arnold's role in sort of increasing tuition at twice the rate that state appropriations were increased for the university. All of that sort of is made possible by a model in which tuition is a sort of foundational component of university finances, right? So, as you mentioned, that happens back at the beginning of the 70s, essentially with Reagan and sort of the implementation of an educational fee in 1970. Which is sort of forced on the regents at the University of California by Ronald Reagan as part of this sort of culture war against the free speech movement, the anti-war movement on campus. All of that kind of happens sort of long before Arnold Schwarzenegger enters the picture, and then sort of sets the foundation for the higher education compact, which happens in 2003 2003 or 2004, after a sort of multi-decadal trend towards sort of like declining state appropriations for the university, right? So you have the introduction of tuition in 1970, and then Proposition 13 heavily restricts state revenue availability, creates this sense of competition for scarce state resources, series of economic recessions throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, which lead to a secular decline in state funding for the university. All of that is kind of the ground for this decision in 2004 by Arnold Schwarzenegger to commit to refunding the UC, but only if the UC commits to increasing its own tuition revenue year over year, right? Mm-hmm. And then all of that, of course, gets undone in 2008 anyways, with the financial crisis. But that's another story, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that part was very familiar. I was a graduate student then, and it does not escape my memory. I will always hold in my memory two thoughts, because they broke ground on the new Poly Pavilion in the same week that they announced they were raising tuition by 40% over the course of 2 quarters. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, the priorities of the university so elegantly demonstrated in one single moment. Sorry to cut you off, Sammy. Please go ahead.
No. That is like quite relevant. I was just going to sort of say that then. I mean, so the compact is this interesting moment because, as John traces the history leading up to it, means that even in this moment, I think it is 2004, when the compact is being signed and being touted by both the president of the UC and then also of Cal State as restoring stability to the budget. What the stability that it is, quote unquote, restoring is in fact locking in this model of tuition increasing more quickly than state funding is. And so even before sort of the mess of 2008, which again, kind of in common wisdom would hold that is what's responsible for subsequent rises in tuition, but already it was the case beforehand that tuition was rising more quickly. And then the financial crisis hits and Schwarzenegger backs out and unilaterally increases the tuition by enormous amounts 2 years in a row. So things get thrown sort of back into whack, and even as they're building the Poly Pavilion.
Yes, they make the new Poly. I want to move into sort of the present now and think about now. This is something that is a real struggle for us in terms of contingent faculty organizing, because on the one hand, it's important for us to press upon the fact of to our students when we do that kind of outreach that, this is bad for us. Lecturers can't afford to live in the communities where they teach, our lack of job stability. We try to emphasize all those things, but there's a tension there, right? Because we don't want our students to feel like they're getting the short stick or they're getting some kind of inferior education. We consider ourselves to be incredible educators and wonderful teachers. And so, I wouldn't want a conversation about the rise of contingent faculty to dwell on that too much. But you also offer a couple really helpful ways about thinking about how adjunctification, gigification impacts the professors themselves and their students. One of the terms I absolutely love is the just-in-time professorate. So maybe you can start there, and maybe then one of you could talk about the kind of decoupling of the functions, the traditional functions of professors on campus. You point to research and teaching, but there's that third element of advising and mentoring that you also layer in, which I thought was really interesting. So maybe let's start with the just-in-time professorate, which is a term that I will keep with me in my pocket and carry around forever. So please.
Yeah, I think that came out of like a House subcommittee on education report about the condition of academic employment. I really think it's very provocative too. It's another economic analogy, right? Like the gig economy. In this case, we're referring to just-in-time production, which is a kind of feature of flexible production models for firms to sort of quickly sort of produce and deliver commodities or parts or whatever it may be on an as needed basis. And that's exactly what's happening with teaching at the university as well, right? In the case of contingent faculty, it's really the sort of very short lead time that contingent lecturers, non-tenured faculty are generally given, which is a way for the university to kind of flexibly meet student demand for course offerings in the lowest lead time possible. And then there's the sort of other side of this, which is the less than annual or semester or quarter based contracts that many contingent teachers are working under. So it's really a striking. It resembles like very closely the kind of just-in-time production principles that happen in the modern factory or whatever. And it's a really distinct contrast from the ways in which tenure faculty have very inflexible contracts for the university, right? So there's an extremely high level of employment security that exists in almost no other job, and lifetime sort of guarantees of employment that obviously if you're a university that is looking at sort of volatile and declining funding and a need to sort of meet the teaching responsibilities that you have at the lowest possible cost, is like not an attractive alternative to the just-in-time model.
And it's interesting. The just-in-time model of industrial production is what a lot of people are talking about now as at root of the supply chain issues. So it all connects.
Thanks, Sam Walton.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit there, because you guys do spend a significant amount of time talking about the impacts on student learning, and I think you pull out some really interesting threads that I think do add nuance in the way I was describing of the tensions of not wanting to make it seem like every contingent faculty member is so overworked and underpaid that the quality of instruction suffers. You pull out some more interesting and subtler threads. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Adriana Kazar, whose work we mentioned earlier, who also writes about the gig academy, has a nifty phrase, I think, for this, which she calls the lack of opportunity to perform. And so the idea is that I think you're right. It's like we really don't want to contribute to an idea that contingent instructors are bad instructors or something, because that's certainly not the case at all. But instead, and what we really try to do in this report is to draw some more attention to the conditions of their work. And so one of the big things is these deeply short-term contracts that and this just-in-time model that John was just describing, but also things like not having any office space or having a hugely heavy teaching load. And so I know you were asking about the decoupling of teaching and research, and where under the kind of classic model of tenured professordom, that there was an idea that professors would both perform teaching duties and research duties, and then also engage, like you say, in mentorship, and then also faculty governance, where they were able to sort of have a good deal of autonomy and control over the conditions of their work. And now each of those pieces is kind of being pulled apart. And so what that means for contingent instructors is that often, people will sign contracts where they teach 4 courses a semester. And that's an extremely heavy load where you really don't have time to do anything but be kind of like prepping always for and trying to grade and like you're sort of that sort of contract, I think, is much less common. I really want to say it doesn't happen. I'm sure it does in some places, but much less common, certainly for tenured professors to sort of have to devote that amount of time and energy to purely teaching. And then particularly if you don't have sort of, some contingent instructors are working on multiple campuses at once. Some contingent instructors, and maybe those are in different cities too. So I think that what that adds up to is what Adriana Kazar describes as the lack of opportunity to perform sometimes, where it's like because of kind of these conditions under which contingent instructors are being expected to teach, add that to the fact that they're often teaching the courses that tenured professors least want to teach, huge introductory courses or something. It just means that they're not kind of able to teach as well as realistically they could teach given better working conditions. That really ends up being, I think, kind of a major focus of our report, because the idea, we really do want to reframe it from a sense of, well, contingent instructors are less quality instructors to, if we want the university to be as good of a university as it can be, and it employs many contingent instructors, then it's totally wrong-headed to try to sort of squeeze as much as possible out of these contingent instructors instead of treating them as good instructors who, given the opportunity to perform, can indeed perform, and teach up to their full potential. And so even in some of the data that we're looking at in terms of educational outcomes, you can really sort of disaggregate where outcomes among students of contingent instructors, like full-time instructors who have multi-year contracts, educational outcomes look a lot more like tenured professors. So the question then is of job stability, right? Rather than like the almost arbitrary question of tenure versus non-tenure.
I mean, I think you're also pointing to the ways that the growth of this gigified workforce actually hurts tenured folks as well, because those responsibilities fall to them, right? When you decouple the mentoring stuff, for example, like up until recently, lecturers couldn't serve as advisors on senior thesis or help in those other kind of support functions for students because we didn't have the bona fides to do that. And so all that work then falls on a smaller and smaller number of tenured folks. Certainly faculty governance, curriculum development, departmental stuff, departmental service. Some of our members are able to participate in that. Some lecturers I know have departments that really involve them there. Others leave them out, and that just means a fewer and fewer number of tenured folks who can serve in those roles and those positions. So I think in part, that's why you're seeing the growth of kind of alt-ac positions, as they're called sometimes, where people are hired in full-time but often contingent and certainly not tenured roles to take some of that admin load off of their tenured colleagues who are expected to do cutting-edge research, teaching, committee service, and to develop new departments and programs and steward all the administrative burden that comes with that. So I definitely think, you could really see the growth of these things. It hurts tenured folks as well in some ways. I do want to, however, cue in on the part that you just said, which is the thinking forward and really the recommendations portion of this report. The UC has just come out with this kind of 2030 vision. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what's in that vision for the university and kind of what isn't, and your recommendations on things that should be added or at least should be on their radar as we move into this new sort of development period.
Yeah, so I mean, UC 2030 is this proposal from the regents to, it's to increase the number of graduates from the University of California by an additional 200,000 students by 2030, which is on top of the estimated 1 million students that the UC plans to graduate by that time. Also, there are components of this that are about closing achievement gaps between students from different backgrounds, trying to sort of increase retention and persistence among student populations. So all of these things, they're admirable goals, I think, and it's I think a step in the right direction to try and sort of formalize them in this way, in a sort of forward-looking, long-term plan. But I think for me and for Sammy, the goal isn't realistic without taking into consideration the roles that contingent faculty or non-tenure track faculty are going to play in this process. And we've already talked about sort of the relationship between contingent teaching and academic or educational outcomes for students. And, there's a whole body of research that suggests that students tend to do better academically when they have more sustained faculty interaction, right? That's just like
surprise.
surprise for nobody really, but it's a an absolutely essential element of student success, right? So if UC 2030 is going to accomplish its goals, I think that the university needs to more directly address within that plan how non-tenured lecturers are going to contribute to the achievement of its goals, of the university's goals. It's the faculty who aren't on the tenure track at the University of California. They do an enormous amount of the teaching required to graduate these students. I think it's something like 47% of the undergraduate teaching at the University of California is done by lecturers. So they can't really be an afterthought here.
Yeah, and so there are things. So then, in our report, we offer suggestions for the state, for the federal government, also, yeah, which I'm sure they're waiting on our suggestions to decide what to do next. But also to the university, there really are things that the university itself can do, kind of in order to meet its own goals. So like the sort of overarching one, as John was just suggesting, is to kind of incorporate lecturers, non-tenure track faculty, into this plan. So part of that means kind of focused on maybe data collection, thinking about surveying contingent faculty to get a sense of where people's income is coming from. Are they only acting as contingent faculty at the university, or are they, a professional dancer who teaches a dance class, right? And then maybe so it's good to have a sense of who it is, in fact, that is performing these contingent instruction duties. The university could itself kind of think about the link between workplace conditions for its instructors and learning outcomes. And then also, it really ought to be, we think, setting specific goals about length of employment of lecturers. And you all just won some gains with that, with your latest contract, which mazel tov. And but also the proportion of full-time to part-time lecturers, and also then specific goals about pay disparities between tenure track and non-tenured faculty, which right now are enormous, certainly to our eyes, I think. And then also maybe one last one, which is slightly oblique here, but related, is a lot of people write about administrative expansion as at root of kind of cost increases at the university, and so maybe then as the university is thinking about part-time versus full-time instruction and tenure track versus non-tenure track instruction, also the ratio of administrators who are being hired to instructors, because there's, we cite data showing that the sort of relative boost to educational and research outcomes from hiring more administrators is less than the same money that's being devoted to instruction. So there really is a lot that by the university, instead of, over the course of our report, I think lecturers emerge as something of an afterthought. It's as if people, it's like a stopgap measure to deal with the declines in state funding and volatility in state funding. We really think that instead, they ought to be foregrounded, or at least, considered as part of kind of the model for how the university will reach its own goals as part of the UC 2030 plan.
Absolutely love it. Okay, I'm going to put in one last plug to be sure to read this incredible report that John and Sammy have written at luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. And then I thought maybe we just end here because we're wrapping up. What can workers themselves do? We just want a big contract, but we know that work isn't done. We know the graduate students are about to enter their own period of contract negotiations. So as a labor historian, as a trade unionist myself, I'd love to hear what you guys think academic workers could do, maybe fights and battles that we could take on together and ways that we can improve the university from the ground up, because that's actually something I can act on. I don't have a line into Michael Drake, but I certainly do in other respects. So maybe I thought we'd maybe end there and go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I mean, part of, it was interesting for us to sort of write this report as you all were negotiating. And then sort of right before the report came out, you successfully reached your deal. And so sort of scooped us in the real world. But so some of the things, that we would have said were, fighting for like really, stability and pay and things that let you perform. And obviously workers are, in fact, doing that. Another thing, though, is I think we've turned now to think about, there are a couple sort of promising national efforts to try to affect national policy changes. So one is Higher Education Labor United, which is a coalition of higher ed unions, and then also Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education. And they were supporting, I think, the College for All Act. And so some of the things that they then think about are sort of trying to enact via policy, trying to enact standards. The federal government distributes a lot of aid and a lot of funding to universities nationwide via Pell Grants, other mechanisms. And so it's sort of a pressure point by which federal labor standards about things like the ratio of tenure track to non-tenure track faculty, or about sort of pay parity between tenure track and non-tenure track faculty can be enacted. So if universities and colleges have to meet certain standards in order to have these federal monies dispersed to them, then that is sort of one promising avenue. And it seems a little less, pie in the sky than maybe it would have before our report, because it seems like really there was kind of a quickening of this nationally focused organizing during the pandemic. And so that seems like one kind of possibly promising avenue. And then also on sort of a smaller scale, but trying to sort of regionally coordinate efforts among higher education unions. And so the SEIU has been doing that. The AAUP has been trying to think about metropolitan level bargaining to sort of build power, not just on campus, on a certain campus, but kind of in regional labor pools.
And just on a final note, I mean, as you allude to, Caroline and Sammy, the university is a workplace where many different kinds of workers are working and employed, and they're represented by, an array of different unions. But all of these workers, I think, face similar challenges. And, for what it's worth, in the COVID year, the single biggest decline in jobs at the UC was, first of all, student workers, like student work study positions, were almost halved, and then professional and support staff, so non-faculty jobs. And so we're all kind of facing the same challenges and the same problems that a privatized public university sort of creates for its workers. And so I think solidarity and support from each of these distinct groups on campus is really essential to achieving material wins for everybody.
What a beautiful sentiment to end on. Thank you so much, Sammy and John, for your wonderful work. Thank you so much to the listeners out there of Then and Now. Be sure, again, to check out their report at luskincenter.history.ucla.edu and join us next week for another exciting episode of Then and Now.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Maya Ferdman, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.